King Abdullah came up with some really powerful things when he sat down with his scholars in 2004 and 5 in Amman. And what he was concerned about was to develop two messages, two powerful things which would try and address the abhorrent things that he'd observed which were taking place in the name of Islam. The first message and the first audience were to Muslims worldwide, to remind Muslims worldwide of some very straightforward things that were getting in the way of intra-Muslim relations, and that's been referred to. And I think the second audience were non-Muslims who were constructing all sorts of narratives and counter-narratives and misconceptions and sort of a whole library full of fallacies that were informing the sort of emergence of a pretty difficult period. He saw this as a battle between ideas, but also a battle of perceptions, battle of feelings, and that it wasn't a new thing, that it has happened many years prior. And most of my discussion around this reflects on the fact that the Amman Message tried to take a position in something that was almost out of control, tried to take back. It's quite an interesting use of phrase. I only use this because it's been used so much by the Trumps and the Brexit arguments, that take back something. And it almost implies that we want to go back in some sense of nostalgia to a place where it was much better. But of course, in reality, if you're a historian, you'll know it was never better, and it was just different. And the argument, the power of nostalgia, is something we need to be really cautious about. There's some very straightforward things, and I'm sure my slides can be available if anyone wants them. But the three parts of the Amman Message and the 3 points that we're in help define at that time who was a Muslim. It was a matter of helping with the confusion in identity that had arisen. It helped to answer the question about who could be declared an apostate and what basis that could be used. And finally, it reminded Muslims and non-Muslims about the source of fatwas and who had the authority to issue that. This was quite controversial at the time, but you'll know, I'm sure some of you, that the authority given to the message could only be derived from having a sense of consensus, ijma, and this was achieved by the chairmanship of King Abdullah. You can see much more of the discussion about the emergence of that and the power of the message. What was interesting to a simple academic was why this message had sat and had no impact, to my judgment, at all. It was quite powerful. In our travels around, we'd met many of the signatories, various distinguished scholars in more than 90 different countries, but yet it had had very little impact. And it made me think far more about the complexity and the nature of the context. At that time, it was before I returned to universities, and I was doing what Peter was reminding was happening at that time, only not for the Americans, but for the British government. So I ran the British government's major program for engaging with the Islamic world through the auspices of the British Council. And we were spending a huge amount of money doing exactly what the Americans were trying to do as well. And it relates very strongly to this misconception, this belief that by identifying this large sort of global whatever, Muslims, we could go out and engage with them in somehow differently to other ways. So I related very strongly to that part of Peter's presentation earlier. And the challenge I was then watching was the challenge facing Muslims in a minority in places which were becoming quite hostile and quite challenging as context for them. And it took me to try and explain the nature of identity and identity politics and to reflect on a lot of that literature. And you'll know, the psychologists will tell us, that people have two basic psychological needs. They need to belong, and they need to be different. And this writ large is the crisis of identity that many are having in our diverse and eclectic world. And this one group, Muslims of different origins who arrive in different places, are having one of the biggest challenges of all. So let's see if I can get it right. Yep. Sorry, I've been changing mine and not yours. I beg your pardon. And the consequence of this development of an identity politics has meant that the challenge of modernity is now seen as the major and overwhelming fact in the lives of most Muslims. Now, what's the solution to this? I don't, in the book, I've talked a lot more about the critique of ideas of Huntington and others about the clash of civilizations, and I'll leave you to consider that and look at that. What I'm more interested in is in the way we deal with identity generally in everyday academic and other narratives. We have a tradition of looking at the multiplicities of identities in a complex world that can be used or abused in different ways. So the very hybrid identities that we often refer to, the African American, the Muslim European, the Christian Democrat, themselves can be really problematic. So one of the things we began to look at, and I'm now looking at for some more work, is the extent to which we should switch the emphasis away from multiple identities and maybe from highlighting and focusing on the identity politics, which is now so toxic, and looking at the creation of a new paradigm, a new way of looking at identity, which doesn't allow people either to choose part of themselves and present it, or be chosen by others. And this really relates to some work we're doing on the notion of what I call a cocktail identity. And if anyone's interested, I haven't got time to explain it in full now, but there is a TED talk I've given on this you can find on YouTube. When you go into a bar and order a cocktail or a mocktail, it's a drink that's made up of many different parts of my age, my sex, my faith, whether I have children, my sexual orientation. All these things are ingredients to my identity. But unlike a cocktail, we seem to keep all these as separable elements in people. In the bar you go in and you have your Mai Tai or your margarita or whatever. All these ingredients go in and they're shaken up and they become one drink, one identity. And it's a way of thinking of identity politics in a new way that allows us all to be individual, different, quite complex, but actually we belong to a different tribe here. We belong to the human race, which is probably helpful in some of the contexts we have. I'm most concerned in trying to be practical, in trying to look positively at what we can do in the context that we described, and I apologise, not very coherently, about keep talking with an objective of calming fears and, as I've said here, and reviving faith. Calming the fears as part of the conversation, taking the worst case scenarios and exploring them more fully, having the difficult conversations that are needed to, but also reviving faith that it is compatible to have people of difference that can coexist in harmony of some kind. The Europe that I understand now and that we're looking at is very much a real and reviving culture in contemporary world, but also is a negotiated place. We're just not very good at negotiation, and it's that which I think require much more of our attention. Talking is a modern thing to do, and my last comment really is that there are a number of areas which you can use as examples to show the importance of dialogue and some of the areas that are difficult. And we've done a lot of this in our current research. So can we sit and talk about values openly? Can we talk about technology openly? Can we look at feminism and patriarchy in mixed groups? These are very difficult things to confront, but nonetheless very important. Can we look at representative democracy and explore how that fits in with the contemporary life of young Christians, young Jews, or young Muslims? And can we look, as we saw at an earlier presentation, at the impact of social media and social justice? So, in my apologies that I've tried to do too much in a short period of time, but essentially looking at the work that we did on the book that's shown here, that looked at the contribution that a significant authority brought to bear in terms of helping to create messages for two groups within this contested terrain, both of Muslims and of non-Muslims, and the issues that are raised about the crisis of identity, partly because of critiques of how Muslims are coping with modernity or not, as the case may be, and the issue of dialogue and the importance of having difficult conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.